All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, we're gonna talk about what cool boy Stephen Fulton Jr. has to say about the Errol Spence Jr. Terence Crawford fight and who he picks to win. Let's talk about that and why. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. This is going to be a very fun video for me to do because I get a chance to talk about cool boy Stephen Fulton Jr., the unified super bantamweight champion of the world, has the WBO and the WBC championship, recently beat one of my favorite guys down in them little weight classes, Omar Figueroa's younger brother. What is it? Omar Figueroa, forgive me, Brandon Figueroa, Omar Figueroa's younger brother, in a unified championship to become one of the America's few unified champions, joining guys like Errol Spence Jr. in that regard. So Ellie Sethback, shout out to Ellie Sethback, caught up with Steve Fulton Jr. and asked him a bunch of questions about, the upcoming year in boxing, and Stephen Fulton Jr. answered the questions. Specifically talked about, asked him who his favorite fighters were and who he thought the best fighters in the world were. And of course, that leads into a conversation about Errol Spence Jr., Terence Crawford, and Jaron Boots Ennis. Now, I was going to talk about, and I don't, for the sake of the title of this video, I did not put Jaron Ennis in the conversation. However, upon editing, I might do that because Stephen Fulton Jr. is asked who he thinks is going to win these fights. And he says, who do you think, this is Ellie Sethback asking him, who do you think is going to win between Jaron Ennis and Terence Crawford? And Steve Fulton Jr. says, he believes that Jaron Ennis will beat Terence Crawford. He says that, he's been in the ring, been in the gym a lot with Jaron Boots Ennis, and he knows what Jaron Ennis can do, being in the gym. He says he hasn't been in the gym with Terence Crawford, so all he really has to judge off of is what he sees in the boxing ring. And he thought that, Jaron Ennis would beat him. But, the reason why I didn't really want to lead with that in the video is because I know that Steve Fulton Jr. is from Philadelphia and is also, is from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and, is a friend of Jaron Ennis, grew up with Jaron Ennis. So I was like, I don't know, man. People more than likely are going to say, okay, he's just saying that because he's friends with Jaron Ennis. So wasn't really going to lead or talk about too much about that. But then he came in and mentioned Errol Spence Jr. And he said, well, I think Errol Spence Jr. beats Terence Crawford too. Now, the reason that he gives for that is something that I thought was very, very insightful, but I had not heard anybody say it in that particular fashion. Where he says, for me, this Stephen Fulton Jr. talking, for me, he talked about Errol Spence Jr.'s guard and how tight Errol Spence Jr. is. And he was like, look, the man is just so fundamentally sound that it is going to be very, very difficult for Terence Crawford to really land anything effectively on him because he's just so tight with his defense. But he said, he compared that to Terence Crawford, who he said thinks it's going to be easier for Errol Spence Jr. to catch him because he has more of a street style, more of like a street fighting style, more of a loose type of style that may give Errol Spence Jr. more opportunities to land punches. And I just thought that was a real good observation, or a unique observation. I had never heard anybody explain it in that fashion and really talk and use Errol Spence Jr.'s high guard as a reason why, as an advantage in the fight with Terence Crawford, where most people that you talk to, and I'm not saying just Terence Crawford fans, but if you listen to guys like Tim Bradley, you listen to other professional fighters talk, they pretty much discount the way that Errol Spence Jr. moves forward as being kind of basic, and always talk about the different weapons that Terence Crawford has relative to Errol Spence. But if you listen to Derek James, the trainer of Errol Spence Jr., says, that's pretty much echoing with what Fulton Jr. is saying. And he's saying, when he says, look, man, Errol Spence Jr.'s defense is highly underestimated because it's just so tight and it's so technical, right? And a lot of people do not pick up on how subtle Errol Spence Jr. is with his hand placement and how good Errol Spence Jr. is at picking off shots by parrying shots or blocking shots, right? And when I hear him talk about that, and when I hear Steve Fulton Jr. talk about it, it goes back to like a story that I heard that was told by Archie Moore. If you remember or if you're familiar with the old time boxer Archie Moore, who used to fight in kind of like a crab type of guard, but he was one of the very early trainers for Muhammad Ali, and he would try to get Muhammad Ali to fight in with a higher guard, where Ali is very famous for leaving his hands down low and leaning back. And he was like, look, man, if Muhammad Ali had listened to me, he would have wound up taking a lot less punishment later on in his career, because he would have been able to block and parry a lot of shots versus always relying on his reflexes to get out of the way. And that is something that I think carries through in the comparison between Errol Spence Jr. and Terence Crawford, is being pointed out by Steve Fulton Jr., where you have Errol, whose hands are always, actually in the southpaw stance, is right here a lot of the time. He does fight sometime in different guards, but he's right there to pick off shots with his elbows, to pick off shots with his hands. And if you watch the fight very, very closely, you see a lot of that happening, where during the few times where Terence Crawford has gotten caught, it's been Terence Crawford being caught with his hands down, getting caught when he's in the mix or carrying his hands below his chin, right? In more of a style where, he holds his hands lower down, closer to his waist than Errol Spence Jr. that keeps it high. So I just thought that was a very, very good, very interesting observation, and one that the viewers of this video might come to appreciate. And that's not saying, of course, that Errol Spence Jr. that I think Errol Spence Jr. is going to blow away Terence Crawford, but it's just, I really do favor guys that have a very, very tight defense, and especially when you start dealing with guys that are getting up there in age, and when your reflexes start slowing down and your athleticism starts slowing down just a little bit, you can start getting caught where your reflexes and stuff, maybe a couple years before may have gotten you out of the way, and that's something that Terence Crawford might have to worry about if this fight doesn't take place in 2022, if it goes to 2023 and he fights him at age 30, at 35 or 36 years old, those type of reflexes can slow down. And also, when you have a guy that is very technically sound and also has good hand speed, like Errol Spence Jr. has, and is looking for looking for openings and constantly pressuring you, I think that type of stuff really can come into play. But anyway, like I said, I was going to get to knock out two birds with one stone in this video. One, talking about that observation, and also getting to bring up the name of Stephen Fulton Jr., the super bantamweight champion that I definitely would like to support. And hopefully, he gets into bigger fights, moves up from 122 to 126, we can start seeing him in some big name fights or whatever. He's a really good fighter, 20-0 with 8 knockouts, and maybe I think when the knockouts might increase when he goes up in weight class. But anyway, that's my take on the matter. You let me know what you think in the comment section, and with that, I'm out. Peace.